Your book has some really excellent tables that summarize the major regions of the brain and their function. So let's first look at the cortical gray matter. This localizes and interprets sensory information. It controls voluntary and skilled skeletal activity and functions in intellectual and emotional processing. So this is the executive suite, kind of the level of consciousness, and it has four lobes, which are sensory, and one lobe that is motor. So the four that are sensory are, of course, the parietal, the temporal, the occipital, and then also the insula. The frontal is what is going to be voluntary, which is anterior to the central sulcus. The next section is the basal nuclei. And the basal nuclei is only in the central nervous system. You may see some anatomists that refer to the ganglia as in the central nervous system, but it's actually in the peripheral nervous system. So to prevent making things confusing for you, we're going to refer to basal ganglia in our next chapter. These specific basal nuclei are subcortical motor systems, and they help to control skeletal movements. Remember, they can help to start and stop movements, fine-tune movements. Some of them, like the substantia nigra in the midbrain, are going to release dopamine. So they all have specific effects. And remember, there's thousands of them. They're kind of like islands of gray matter, but you are not responsible for the bulk of them. And I've tried to point out the ones that you are responsible for. So that's the cerebral hemispheres. The next major part is the diencephalon, which is kind of in the middle of the brain. It has the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and then it also has the epithalamus, which is primarily going to be the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin. So let's look at the thalamus first. It's the relay center. So it relays sensory information to the cerebral cortex for interpretation, relays those impulses between the cerebromotor cortex and the lower subcortical motor centers. And it's involved in memory processing. The hypothalamus has a whole bunch of functions. It's the chief integration center for the autonomic nervous system, which is the involuntary part, which we'll learn about in chapter 14 in much more detail. It kind of acts like the body's thermostat. It controls food intake, so it is signaled if we are full, if we have satiety, controls water balance, thirst, and biological rhythms and drives. So those circadian rhythms. Remember, one of the nuclei that I wanted you to know was the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And this is the one that controls the circadian rhythms. And the hormonal input of the anterior pituitary gland. You'll learn about that next semester, but basically the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary what to do. And it also acts as an endocrine organ itself because it produces posterior pituitary hormones like ADH and oxytocin. And you don't need to know ADH right now, but it prevents diuresis, which is urine output. And oxytocin, a lot of you probably already know this, but this causes uterus contraction. When women are induced, there is a synthetic oxytocin that they're given called Pitocin. So remember, uterus contraction was one of those positive feedback systems that you learned about back in chapter 1. The next system that we learned about was the limbic system, a functional system. It includes the cerebral and diencephalon structures like the hypothalamus and the front of the thalamus. It's our emotional brain, and it involves memory processing. For those of you men out there, I would not recommend when your girlfriend, fiance, wife is upset at you, don't blame their limbic system. Just listen. So that's a little key for you and your relationship. So the second part of this table and the last part of the table contains the brainstem. And as we know, the brainstem is going to include the midbrain, pons, medulla. And the midbrain contains the superior colliculus, which is visual, and the inferior colliculus, which is auditory. So the startle reflex is in the inferior colliculus, and the ability to track a moving object is in the superior colliculus. There's subcortical motor centers like the substantia nigra. We don't need to know the red nuclei, but the substantia nigra, what's important about it is that it produces dopamine. So it's a problem in diseases like Parkinson's. And it contains projection fibers. Remember, I told you you do not have to know the pyramidal tracts. The pons is going to relay information from the cerebrum to the cerebellum, cooperates with the medullary respiratory centers to control respiratory rate and depth. So since the pons is superior to the medulla, it can modify the rate and depth. Notice that the medulla is basically set to generating a respiratory rate. The medulla has ascending sensory pathways, impulses from the skin, and proprioceptors through the nucleus cuneatus and gracilis. There are a couple tracts that have the word cuneatus and gracilis in them that we'll be learning, but it has a lot of visceral nuclei in them, which control heart rate, blood vessel diameter. The blood vessel diameter would be the vasomotor center. It also has things like vomiting and coughing in them. It relays sensory information to the cerebellum. You don't have to know the inferior olivary nuclei. And it has projection fibers, and it's a site for desiccation of corticospinal tracts, which are the pyramids. And decussation just means that they cross over to the opposite side of the body. Then finally, the reticular formation, which is a functional system, is going to maintain that the cerebral cortex is alert, filters out repetitive stimuli, and helps to regulate skeletal and muscle activity. And then finally, the cerebellum processes information from the cerebral motor cortex, the proprioceptors, and visual and equilibrium. That's why we have the spinocerebellar cortex that I mentioned earlier as well. We could think of the reticular formation almost as acting like an alarm clock, if you will. So the cerebellum provides instructions to the cerebral motor cortex, subcortical motor centers, resulting in smooth, coordinated skeletal muscle movements and responsible for balance and posture. So the four main parts of the brain are the cerebral hemispheres, the diencephalon, the brainstem would be number 3, and finally the cerebellum would be number 4.